Okay, we're recording.
So thank you everyone for coming. I'll let you go ahead, Amanda.
I didn't hear anything you said just now. It just was kind of broken up there.
Oh, that's okay. I was just welcoming everybody and I was giving you the floor for your introductions.
Okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, you're breaking up a little bit, but it should be okay.
Should be okay.
Slowly. Yeah.
Okay. So my name's Amanda. Tonight I'm going to be hosting tonight's conversation on physical and sexual consent, which I'm actually really excited for, being a survivor myself. Like, this is something that I find very useful, and it's just something that I think a lot of people can benefit from. So thank you for putting together this one. I was really excited to be here for this. So yeah, my name's Amanda. Chloe, whenever you're ready to start, we can get started. I'll put myself on mute just so you're not hearing all the noise in the background.
No worries. Well, thank you so much, Amanda. As Amanda said, my name is Chloe. I also do my work as the Reiki. I'm super pleased to be here with OnePeopleTO. This is my second week. Last week we talked about parent-to-child consent, and it was a really awesome conversation. So I look forward to this one as well. What we'll be discussing today, as Amanda said, is physical and sexual consent. We'll be also discussing how to practice safer sex positivity and what that looks like. So we'll go ahead and jump right into it. Let me share my screen. And before we do, I invite everyone to get comfortable in the space, whatever that looks like for you. Whether that's sitting or laying, you're welcome to keep your camera on or off, whatever is most accessible. We will be doing a journaling activity later on. So feel free to grab your journal or notebook or any type of paper and pen or writing utensil. And then we'll be doing that a little bit later on. So let's go ahead and share the screen. And if at any, sorry, Amanda. If at any time anyone needs the pacing adjusted, whether that's slowing down or speeding up or clarifying anything, you're more than welcome to let me know in the chat, and I'll make sure to attend to that. So this is going to be practicing safer sex positivity run through OnePeopleTO. We'll also be discussing body layer consents. As mentioned before, my name is Chloe. I also do my work as the Reiki, as a holistic health and consent educator, as well as Reiki practitioner. So my lens is very community-based, as well as arts-based. And so I hope that this is an awesome opportunity for us to learn and unlearn together. Yeah, and I'm looking forward to it. So first we'll start with a land black body acknowledgement, which I believe Amanda has prepared.
So again, I'd like to thank everyone for being here. And I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the land that I'm on and the land on which OnePeopleTO resides. I honor the fact that we are on traditional territory of many nations and are now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, that we have a long way to go to reconcile the ways in which Indigenous peoples have been subjected to genocide on their own land, the land which I now as a settler reside, live, and thrive. OnePeopleTO is committed to our own part in healing and honoring the Indigenous ways of knowing and being. And I'd also like to take a moment to honor the Black bodies in this space and on the recording for those who may watch this after the fact, speaking to the traumas of many Black folks who were brought through the Middle Passage into slavery, but also to acknowledge that before these last 400 years, Black bodies and minds were leaders of nations, communities, and families in bright, educated, and in wise ways. This means that Black life does not start nor end with slavery. We speak life into the Black bodies all over the world and inspire personal healing, autonomy, and success. So, floor back to you.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. I love that land acknowledgement so much because it not only identifies paying our dues to the land that we are currently on, but it acknowledges that cross section of being a settler and being in a racialized body, and the ways in which we are not exempt from also being conscientious of the ways that we also attribute to Indigenous harm, but also acknowledging the fact that colonization is something that has affected all of us who exist in racialized bodies in many different ways. It seems fitting there's a cop car in the back. Amazing. I also want to say that on the topic of acknowledgement, that the topics that we'll be discussing today in terms of consent and physical consent, and in terms of acknowledging our bodies and ourselves as sacred, that this is one of the ways that we can be in direct resistance to colonization and in direct resistance to the trickle down of white supremacy that has made us feel unsafe and experienced unsafety in our own bodies and perpetuating that system of violence. And so I want to acknowledge that as well and welcome everyone in the space again, and thank you for being here. So our time together today will look like this. So we'll first start off by doing a bit of foundational knowledge on what is holistic health, what is energetic self-care, as well as defining consent and the body layers. We'll talk about sex positivity, defining that as well as discussing self-pleasure. We'll have a bit of a break, and when we're back, we'll discuss what it means to decenter cis bodies and our topic in our conversation, of sex positivity. We'll also talk about fatness and fat phobia and the place that that has in our conversation, as well as decentering penetration. For the end part of our time together, we'll have a discussion on what our sex positivity looks like and how it influences our life. And we'll check out with an activity, which is our self-love letter, a little bit of a journal prompt, and then we'll check out all together. So I love to first start off a lot of my workshops and presentations by reminding folks that this is a safer space, and by creating it what is called a safer space agreement. So you'll notice I use the word safer as opposed to safe, simply because we can never guarantee what others can define as a safe space for themselves, because we don't, of course, know what everyone's triggers are or what everyone actually needs. And so what we can do instead is cultivate a safer space whereby we have some foundational guidelines to help us exist and feel respected while we're here. And so this looks like creating a culture of care by reminding ourselves and each other that it is a self-first space, meaning that we are always allowed to put ourselves first while we're here. As I touched upon earlier, that looks like sitting or laying down, keeping your camera off, rejoining after a minute. Whatever you need to do is totally valid and totally welcome here. We live in a culture where it is definitely sometimes expected for us to put our own needs to the side to make sure to get work done. And I just want to clarify that that's not what kind of space this is. Next, we want to remind everyone about assumption checking. This looks like making sure to not make any assumptions in any regard. And this can simply be combated just by asking if you have a question. This pertains to not making assumptions on anyone's identity, anyone's pronouns. Again, we can just ask. Confidentiality, as we discuss topics pertaining to deeply personal things and misjustices, it's always important to make sure that, Toronto life, it's always important to make sure that we are creating an environment where folks know that they can share confidentially. And if it ever is the case that we want to share something that anyone else has said, it's as simple as asking them if it's all right to share with anyone else. Lastly, we want to make sure that we're always honoring our voice. We have very important, valuable things to say, and this is certainly a space where that's welcome. So if at any point you have anything that you'd like to comment or ask, again, you're more than welcome to put that in the chat. And we'll also have a portion later on for discussion if you'd like to vocalize anything. Empathetic listening is, of course, listening with our hearts and listening to understand rather than listening to prove a point or speak over anyone. And lastly, making sure we're taking accountability. Since we'll be discussing a lot of phobia, so a lot of like fat phobia, for example, or transphobia, it's important for those who occupy cis bodies or for those who occupy thin adjacent or thinner bodies that we are doing that inner work to assess the ways that we've been harmful and to make sure that we're being intentional in our language moving forward, and just doing that inner reflection, which is a huge part of accountability. So, an introduction to holistic health and energetic self-care. So we'll first start off with an introduction to defining what holistic health even is. So holistic essentially describes the relationship between each individual part and how each part is connected to the quality of the whole unit. So for example, if we're looking at a body, a holistic view of the body would be to look at it as a whole, not only the physical body, but the other layers that make it up. On a more literal level, if we're looking at a holistic sense, we're looking at how each part contributes to the entire part rather than singling out one specific part and using that part to represent the whole, because it usually doesn't. Holistic health is essentially our understanding of health as being comprised of many layers aside from just the physical. So again, if we go to a doctor in the West, especially in the Western world, we will likely be assessed based on our physical bodies. And that view of health is very much helpful, of course, for some, but it does not have a very holistic approach in that we're not usually at the same time check for spiritual or mental health. And so again, it is looking at things from a viewpoint where we can see each individual piece and how it all connects rather than singling out the part that we think is the most important. So with holistic health, this involves exploring the connection between our physical, emotional, and energetic bodies, which we will discuss a little bit later on. Energetic self-care is described as the sacred practice of sending love to and treating ourselves like loved ones. So when it comes down to it, self-care is the act of taking that care that we give to our loved ones and also giving some of that back to ourselves. So really creating a relationship where we're allowed to give ourselves gifts of kindness and nice things. Energetic self-care looks like developing a curiosity about our inner state and our emotions. So being aware of the intangible things that affect us, the things that we can't see or describe all the time. It also looks like believing in ourselves as multidimensional beings able to exist and extend beyond only our physical bodies. And I'd also like to acknowledge that a lot of what we're speaking about today falls in line with a lot of Indigenous practices and teachings that were very intentionally stamped out and very intentionally and violently removed from discourse. And so we want to pay homage to that and also reintroduce these ways of speaking about ourselves and speaking about our bodies as layered things rather than just a simple black and white or a simple physical body that we can see. Because we're much more than that. Speaking of, we'll take this time to define the body layers. So that being the physical, energetic, and emotional bodies. I like to tell folks to remember to check their pee. So your physical body is essentially the first layer that we can see. It's the dense, tangible, visible layer that looks like skin, muscles, organs, brain. It's a layer that we spend most to all of our time in. And there is a very heavy emphasis placed on physical health specifically, or physical acknowledgement, as opposed to energetic or emotional. So our energetic body basically is the invisible and powerful field that is connected to life itself. It's what connects us to life. Some people might understand this as chi, prana, ki. Essentially, it's the same thing. It's what we call life force energy. So our energetic bodies are responsible for the coordination of natural rhythms and patterns. So for example, our heart beating and our food metabolizing and our food digesting. So these are processes that happen at a very ritualistic way that we don't necessarily have full control over. We don't tell our bodies when to metabolize food. We don't tell our blood to oxidize. We don't tell our heart to beat. These are natural processes that have a lot to do with our energetic bodies as well as our physical bodies. So our energetic bodies is what connects us to chakras, meridians, and other energy systems for those that are familiar. Our emotional body is what allows us to process our thoughts and our feelings and our emotions. So it's determined in part by our thoughts, and it's where we feel emotions after understanding them mentally. So, for example, if somebody leaps out and scares us, the first thing that will happen is our brain will send a signal to our body to release a certain chemical to tell us that we're in danger, that we're in trouble. What happens after that initial physical response is that we feel it in our bodies. Either our heart will start to beat, our stomach will feel sick, and so that has an emotional tie to it. Consider also the feelings that we get right after something very abrupt happens. So it is after it has been processed and filtered through the brain and through our mental mind that we're able to understand it on an emotional level. For some of us, it might take even days or weeks to process certain emotions or to understand where certain emotions come from. So it's important to recognize that all three body layers are interconnected and rely on one another and have to do with one another. For example, if someone is consistently stressed out and lacking energy, that's going to show in their physical body, that's going to make them feel not so great, and that will also lead to health concerns after a prolonged amount of time, after a prolonged amount of stress on the body and on the brain. So we can kind of see how all the layers interconnect. And again, I invite everyone who has a question, if you do have a question, you're welcome to ask at any time. So on consent and the body layers, this is essentially looks like what consent can look like at the physical, energetic, and emotional level. So at the physical level, consent can look like asking and waiting for a clear yes before entering anyone's physical space. Excuse me. It can look like not making any assumptions based on anyone's appearance, for example, making any assumptions about gender. It can look like refraining from making comments about someone's body or physical appearance. One very important part of physical consent is maintaining friendly body language after a loved one has set a boundary or told us no. This is a piece of physical consent that we might not think of very often, but what happens is when somebody tells us no or lays down a boundary for something that they don't want to happen, and we show in our body language that we're upset or we are withholding, then that is communicating to that loved one that it's not okay to us when they set a boundary or when they decide what's best for them. And so in that way, we're impeding on their abilities to make decisions for themselves. In that way, we are participating in something called coercion, which is a non-consensual practice. Physical consent can also look like refraining from holding others in an over-sexualizing or over-subjective gaze, especially when they're not aware of it. This, again, is a piece of consent that others might not always think of, but it's a way that people might feel uncomfortable. It's a way that people might feel unsafe, especially when it comes to over-sexualizing or holding someone in a subjective gaze that they did not consent to or ask for. Energetic consent looks like asking someone if they have the space before sharing something heavy, but anything at all that might require them to take up a bit of emotional time. It looks like being conscious of what our capacities are and setting boundaries when we feel like we've had enough. It looks like understanding when others need time or space to recharge and being mindful of the space that you take up, aka reading the room. So for example, if you're in a space where there is sharing, folks are sharing personal things, or folks are opening up, it would make sense in that context to allow room for everyone to have the opportunity to share, and being mindful of the space that you take up and the amount of time that others are giving you, because that is still an exchange, and we want to make sure that it's an equal one. Energetic consent also looks like respecting and appreciating the labor of others, which looks like never volunteering another's labor without asking them. It looks like allowing yourself to feel hard feelings on our own before we share with a loved one. And this is a particularly important practice, because when something big happens, when something happens that really rocks us or has us shook, it's important that we're able to sit with it and actually feel it in our bodies before tossing it on to someone else to do that labor for us. Lastly, emotional consent. So this can look like processing our feelings without projecting them onto others. It looks like not taking other people's feelings or perceptions personally, because we all have our own view of life, we all have our own experiences, and even if someone's view absolutely does not line up with your own, it is then your own decision and responsibility to set a boundary on who is allowed to interact with you and who you'd like in your life. However, it is still a person's decision to act however they want to act. And in that regard, we can't take everything that other people feel or say personally, because it's not about us. Emotional consent looks like avoiding manipulative behavior, such as guilting or coercing, which is that, aw, come on type of energy, making sure that we're taking someone's no at face value and not asking them to define or prove it to us. It also looks like offering content warnings before bringing up certain subjects, allowing others to choose themselves first, even if we're disappointed or we're upset, and very important, not setting ourselves as the standard. So, when I was growing up, one of the things that I was taught was that we need to be treating others the way that we want to be treated. As I got older, I realized, and I actually heard from a very one of my favorite educators, Kim Katrin Milan, who had actually positioned that we should be treating people how they want to be treated. Because when we treat people how we want to be treated, what we do is set ourselves as the standard, and we set ourselves as the norm, and then we kind of view everyone else through that lens. And although our practices are important and matter and have value, it's not how everyone lives their life. And so, what we should be doing is, when we're trying to connect with others and hear other people out, instead of positioning them as us or us as them, we can simply just listen to what their experience is and not set ourselves as anything to be compared to. Whew. Okay, do we have any questions before we move on to our discussion on sex positivity? Okay, awesome. So I do have a question for you then. In your experience, what do you understand sex positivity to be? And we can take a sec to think about this, but I'd like to pose that to the folks that are here. You're welcome to put that in the chat if you'd like, or unmute yourself. And we can pause for a moment while folks gather their thoughts. Well, if we do think of something, then we're always welcome to put that in the chat at any time, on how we define sex positivity for ourselves. So what we'll be talking about today on sex positivity is defining sex positivity as the practice of thinking critically about the way that we judge, shame, or ostracize others for their body, identity, sexuality, or sexual expression, which involves a lot of reflecting definitely and taking accountability for the ways in which we've contributed to harm in that way. Sex positivity looks like intentionally allowing room for comfort, joy, and acceptance regarding sexual expression, identity, and bodies of ourselves, as well as the bodies of others. Sex positivity is deeply necessary to help remove stigma. It encourages transparent, shame free conversations, and it promotes healthy sexual awareness for everyone. The awesome thing about sex positivity is that it's not only limited to sex. There are tons and tons of avenues where we can go to describe what sex positivity means to us. And we'll actually be discussing a few of those avenues later on. Ooh, okay, so I've given you a lot of information to sit with. We've reached our break time. So I will see everybody in 15 minutes. Hi everyone, this is just a 2-minute heads up that we'll be getting started at 7:49, and that's when our break will be ending. Okay, everybody, welcome back. I hope we had a nice full break time, and I appreciate everyone for donating your time this evening. So I wanted to give you a nice full break to kind of recenter. Hopefully you had a second to get some water or look off camera for a moment. Yeah, welcome back everyone. So what we'll be talking about now are around 3 or 4 major areas of conversation. And these are all topics that I believe are super important to our understanding of sex positivity and how we can really bring intersectional care to our conversations about being sex positive. So we'll first start off with understanding self-pleasure. So self-pleasure, and you'll see on the other side, I have a guided question just to keep in mind. But self-pleasure is not inherently sexual. And this is because pleasure is a basic human right. We all like to feel good. We're hardwired that way. And so when you remove sexuality and sex itself from pleasure, we're able to find a lot more room there, and we're able to explore different ways to self-pleasure and different ways that we can get pleasure for ourselves. It is necessary in establishing a self-loving relationship, and it balances out our rest and reward systems, which is essentially the system by which we give ourselves rest and reward. This is super important because our rest and reward system is what dictates our ability to take a break and to congratulate ourselves. And what happens is when our rest and reward systems are out of balance, we can sometimes treat rest as a reward, feeling like we have to work really hard in order to earn the ability to rest, or we have to do something extraordinary to earn a reward, rather than just congratulating ourselves for existing and showing up in our bodies and incorporating that into our self-care, which is why self-pleasure is very important. It helps our brain release chemicals that can help us feel connected, safe, loved. This is good old-fashioned oxytocin, the bonding hormone, but also things like serotonin and dopamine, all chemicals that our brain releases that can help us feel, again, safe, connected, loved, good in our bodies. Self-pleasure is important because it allows us the opportunity to have a healthy sexual as well as sensual and romantic relationship with ourselves first. And this is great because we're able to figure out our needs, what we like, what we want, And this is a wonderful place to start off, especially if we're exploring this as adolescents, as we're growing up, because then our foundational knowledge on how to have a healthy relationship would have first been set, because we would have been practicing instances of self-care and self-pleasure on our own before meeting a partner or partners. And our guided question here is, what is your relationship to self-pleasure? So that's something that we can ponder about. Our second topic is challenging fat phobia. So on fatness and fat phobia, it's very important to introduce this conversation because there is a massive fake sex positivity movement that essentially leaves fat bodies out of the conversation entirely. And this perpetuates fat phobia because it doesn't critique harmful narratives that exist about bigger bodies and also desirability politics. And for those that are not familiar, desirability politics are basically the rules and structures in place, invisible and covert, about what we find attractive and desirable. And historically, because we live in a society that is, again, a trickle down of a white supremacist and capitalist foundation, a lot of the non-desirable bodies looks like non-light bodies, non-thin bodies. So again, fat bodies, darker bodies, older bodies, disabled bodies, and there is a certain space for those people in sex positivity. However, that is not always the case, so we want to call that out. Fatness and fat phobia is something that is certainly important to talk about because there is an erasure of bodies and stories that are not, again, from thin, able-bodied people. Erasure is the process by which we only see and hear stories from certain groups of people, and then we think that other groups of people don't exist, but what's happening is that they're not given the necessary platforms, or when they are speaking, they're silenced, and then the community or society at large might not even know that this is a movement. And so this, again, is something that has happened to people that exist in bigger bodies because there is such a fat phobic society at large where we ostracize and are very nasty to people that exist in bigger bodies. And because of this, there is an erasure and just a non-inclusion in that conversation of body positivity and sex positivity. On that topic, there's a specific interest usually in sexual empowerment, but this interest usually happens when sexual empowerment is speaking about thin bodies, while sexual empowerment for bigger bodies is at times treated with disgust or othered, meaning is kind of treated separately from the whole. So one important guided question we can think about is, how are some ways that we can unlearn and also challenge fat phobic language when we hear it or when we come across it, either colloquially in our circles or when we catch ourselves thinking or saying something that is fat phobic. And fat phobic can be defined as making fun of or ostracizing or even placing yourself above someone that exists in a fat or larger body. So a way that folks do this, for example, is making extra room to overextend, to congratulate people that exist in bigger bodies for being very brave, but they're kind of just posting a picture and doing what everyone else is doing. And so what they're doing is kind of, again, ostracizing them and treating them as an other. And so when thin people congratulate larger people for posting pictures or for being comfortable in their body, they are covertly sharing the message that that's not normal. And so good for you. And that's condescending at best and is incredibly fat phobic. So we want to make sure to check that. Next, we'll talk about decentering cis bodies or cisgendered bodies. So for those that aren't aware, a cisgendered person is essentially a person whose gender and gender identity happens to correspond with their assigned sex at birth. So a cis person is not a trans person and they're not a gender diverse person. So what we find a lot of the time is that cisgendered voices take up a lot of space in the sex positivity movement. And this is because there's a lot of normalized violence about trans bodies and gender diverse bodies. We can combat this violence by understanding that sex positivity is about allowing acceptance for all experience, including experiences that are not ours, and also speaking up when we witness harm. This is important, especially within the current conversation we're having, because trans people have historically fought for fair treatment of sex workers, femmes, Black people, people living with AIDS, and other stigmatized sexual health conditions, and they are really the foundations of the sex positivity movement. So we want to make sure that we're not only acknowledging that, but leaving intentional space for non-cis people, that is trans people, gender non-conforming people, and otherwise gender diverse people to have their voice heard and listened to in our conversation. So one guided question that we can keep in mind is, how can we speak up against normalized hate speech when we hear it? And what are some things we can do to dismantle when we hear transphobia or queerphobia being said out loud? Decentering penetration. This is an awesome topic. So decentering penetration is very, very integral in discussing our conversations on sex positivity. This is because sex positivity is not only about sex, and sex is not only about penetration. Penetration is one type of sex popularized, might I add, by heterosexual culture as what is normal sex. This is incredibly harmful because it discredits queer people and it also discredits other types of sexual engagement. This is a big deal because there have been a lot of pushback from people that believe that you did not have sex if you weren't penetrated, which has been awful in the case of those that are survivors of sexual violence who have had their experiences denied. Decentering penetration is also very important because not enjoying penetration certainly does not make your preferences any less valid and does not make your voice any less important in our topic on sex positivity. Lastly, erection and phallus-centered sex is inaccessible and frankly undesirable for some, and is just not the norm for everyone, and so it shouldn't be positioned as such. So one thing that we can keep in mind when we're considering decentering penetration is, are you comfortable in your own definition of sex? A follow-up question to that can be, do you have your own definition of sex? Because again, it's subjective and it's personal, and we get to decide what defines sex for us and what that looks like with our partners and with ourselves. So some final points, let's make sure that our sex positivity includes sex with people that menstruate, as well as physical, emotional, energetic consent. We want to make sure our sex positivity includes those that do not enjoy sex or sexual activity, people with disabilities. It's important that we challenge stigma against STDs and STIs. It's important that we include parents and pregnant people in our conversation, as well as non-monogamous and polyamorous people. And finally, tons and tons of room for learning and unlearning. People don't exist in a vacuum. There's certainly not one type or two types of humans. And boxing this in and feeling this need to define everything perfectly and categorize it is also a byproduct of colonialism, whereby there was extreme anger and violence in response to things that they did not understand and could not define, especially when it came to gender expression and sexual expression. So we want to make sure that we're understanding that not only are our conversations on sex positivity helpful when we add intersectional knowledge, but it's also a very direct act of resistance against oppression. So we're on to the discussion portion of our time together. So I'll leave you with two questions to consider, and you're welcome to answer them out loud or write them down or put them in the chat. Either way, we'll pause here for a moment. And our discussion questions are, one, how does sex positivity benefit my relationships? And two, how does my sex positivity connect to my boundaries? So we'll pause here while folks digest and consider this. Again, feel free to write it down in your journal and answer it there. And if you'd like to share, you're welcome to unmute yourself or put it in the chat. And in any case, we'll pause here for a couple of minutes to allow folks to gather their thoughts. So we have Raisa in the chat saying, these are certainly questions I've never considered before. Awesome. I'm glad to hear that this is a reflective moment. Yes, thank you for sharing how you're feeling about it. If anyone else wants to share or wants to discuss what's come up for them, you're more than welcome to. Yes, I appreciate the love on the prompts. Just food for thought. Okay. So we're going to move on now to our activity for the evening, which is a self-love letter. I really love doing this. I find that it's an awesome way to connect with myself in terms of what I'm proud of myself for and the things that I would like to acknowledge. And I think for other folks as well, it can be a great way to really, oh my gosh, excuse me, sorry, to really remind yourself of, the things that you're proud of. And so here's the prompt for our self-love letter. It says, "Dear me, thank you for," and you'll fill in the blanks yourself. "Thank you for blank. I am in awe of the way that I can. I feel the most connected to my body and myself when," and some things that I need to feel connected to myself and others right now is, and lastly, when I am feeling down, I want myself to remember. So again, we'll pause here and let others consider the prompt. And then we'll have a moment if anyone wants to share their love letter. And so let's pause for maybe another couple minutes here. Does anyone want more time to write their letter, or are we finished and ready to move on? We'll have this available for folks that aren't aware afterwards too as a recording. So there will be opportunities as well to go back and reflect, which it seems like some people would like to do. Incredible. So that's been the bulk of our time together. I appreciate you listening in. So at this time, if anyone has any questions about any of the content that we've learned today, any of the topics that we've discussed, feel free to ask. Again, feel free to put that in the chat or you can unmute, and we'll pause here just in case there are any questions. Okay, great. And we also have our contact at the end. So for those that are listening at home, if you have any questions, you're more than welcome to send them into the contact information that we'll see towards the end. So thank you again for everyone for showing up and donating your time this evening. This has been Practicing Safer Sex Positivity. We have 2 more workshops coming up in this series with OnePeopleTO on consent conversations. So next Tuesday, we'll be discussing professional consent and workplace wellness, which essentially is what consent looks like in the workplace. And the following Tuesday, we'll be discussing holistic health as well as consent as we age. So we'll be re-going over some of the topics that we talked about today in terms of what holistic health is, what the body layers are, and we'll also be discussing healthcare and consent as we get older, and consent for the elderly as well. So both workshops and all workshops this February have been brought to you by OnePeopleTO. So I have their website and their Instagram below for folks that want to follow. I deeply recommend visiting the site and checking out the Instagram page. They do amazing work. And yes, let's stay in touch. So as stated before, my name is Chloe. I also do my work as the Reiki. I invite you to contact me at thereikiclear.com, as well as Instagram at thereikiclear. I do see someone actually with a question in the chat, so let's read that. They say, related to what you said about being aware of our own body language and reacting / accepting a no from someone, would you say that this may run the risk of becoming self-censorship and not honoring our true feelings? Awesome question. Thank you so much for asking that. So self-censorship is essentially the process by which we betray ourselves by not being honest to what we're feeling and either pretending to feel something different or otherwise kind of nulling down our true reactions. And so there's certainly a line between self-censorship and not projecting, and that essentially lies in the way that you're able to sit with discomfort. So for example, in this scenario where someone has told us no and we're disappointed, it's okay to be disappointed. It's even okay to be mad if that's the emotion that came up for you. You don't necessarily need to define it or justify it right away. What it's not okay to do is toss that on to someone right away. But if you're upset, you can kind of sit with yourself and be like, okay, I'm feeling upset right now. What do I need? You know, you can even communicate this to the person like, okay, that upset me, but I don't want you to think that. I don't want to honor your boundaries. So what I'm going to do is take a walk, or what I'm going to do is sit over here for a sec, or you know what I mean? So it's certainly possible to navigate feeling hard feelings as a result of somebody setting their boundary that doesn't look like perpetuating harm or blame or guilt, but still honors the way that we're feeling. Does that answer your question? Awesome. Glad to hear it. You're so welcome. Again, so this is our stay in touch slide. This has been an amazing evening. I'll pass it on to Amanda just to close us up for the night. And yeah, thank you everybody for showing up.
Chloe, thank you so much for that. I learned a lot. There's a lot that I don't know if you noticed, I was writing notes the entire time. So there's a lot that I'm definitely gonna take some time to reflect on myself. But thank you so much for your time. And definitely can you put that slide back up with the last one there?
Sure,
We
yeah.
can maybe just leave it there and end it there just so that contact information's there and we can keep in touch. I'm definitely going to follow.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so thank you so much. And next week, same time. And what is it? Remind me again. It's workplace wellness.
Yes, workplace wellness and professional consent.
Okay, I'll be here for that too. Thanks so much, Chloe. You guys take care. Okay, bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you so much, Amanda.
Bye.